So yeah, filmmaking, very sensitive subject. We keep kicking The Last Jedi, whatever, and funnily enough, like Hercules, for exactly the same wrong reasons. It's a roughshod trampling of emotional states. Aesthetically amazing, dazzling, gorge, but seems to cash in character and tone for cheap laughs. That's alright with an animation or a cartoon like Hercules, but, multi-million-dollar script like The Last Jedi, come on. I know I'm late to the party on this one, and maybe I'm even watching movies wrong. Who knows? But it took me a while to understand what even pacing and film tone meant, and it was really the insights that I had reading the book on Francis Bacon about the descent that a still image, a painting, a piece of work, a sculpture can have this effect as well, and it's even more difficult to achieve with a single frame rather than 90 minutes or 124 minutes of movie. Amazing, really. And, there's always something to find or discover, like, for example, with Turner. His early paintings very detailed, but later on, it's what he didn't paint that became significant. So yeah, it's dawned on me why it takes so long to write a good screenplay. So many layers to optimize and synchronize and to make sure that they are appropriately in conflict or appropriately not in conflict, that they're not plot contrivances or convenient MacGuffins to move the plot along by convenient means. The temptation for the sake of speed of writing script is to justify thin plot contrivances. It's almost like sometimes they write a story to fit around the conflict or themes of the film, rather than writing a really good story and then having the themes emerge naturally and then embellish what arises, rather than start with the embellishment first and write a film script around that. It's just, well, Predators, that's what I'll say. Or was it Predator? The last one. Yeah, so a bit of a wander off into the world of film there. But yeah, the point of this diversion, Netflix shows, binge watching. At the same time, I like to read up on Wikipedia, the series guide, while watching, and I screwed up with Breaking Bad. I miscounted the seasons and read the finale before I watched it, so that was an own goal. And I've also done this with Person of Interest. I'm not sure I'm going to get to finish the final season. It's already dated, and I really liked it with Taraji. But it got a bit too formulaic. The same with The Blacklist. That started off good, went bad. James Spader, awesome. But the husband and wife in Blacklist, no one would stay in such a relationship of betrayal and contempt. Not ever. Not even super soldier, super spies. Never. It doesn't matter what contrivance or plot twist or subversion of expectation. There's going to be no payoff that's going to reward that kind of insult to my intelligence. Anyway, yeah, Wikipedia. So I look at the viewing figures of the episodes, to gauge how popular the show has been. At first glance, where a show has viewing figures in the season that are about 50% of its opening season, it doesn't last much longer. The classic shark fin shape seems to play out. An initial good audience, a slight rise as word of mouth kicks in, viewership rises to its peak, and then the decline sets in as old stories are stretched out, viewers dwindle, and another network releases the new show. So in response, the current show indulges in crazy or offbeat episodes. Remember that Cops-styled version of X-Files? I kind of like that. Kept me going for a while, longer than I perhaps should have. And some of the sexual tensions are resolved, or suspension of disbelief is stretched. And just sometimes, more often than not, that shark is jumped. Story fatigue, we've seen it all before. I guess really, really good actors with chemistry can draw out another season. Scandal, I think that ended perfectly on the last season. It ended when it needed to. Billions is still going strong. I think we're up to season 5 coming out in a few months. Or is it 4? I've lost count. Yeah, very interesting investigation into human dynamics. Again, insurance and behavioural economics. Needs of the one, needs of the many. Financial returns, ethics, that's all good stuff. But these kind of switching sides films, where people switch sides according to how convenient it is, I don't think people are that flim-flam. So, the plot or the MacGuffins become worn, like in the X-Files, the UFO theme. Ugh. Star Trek, seemed very successful with its morality tales and ethical dilemmas and the tension that caused with the crew in terms of personal and interpersonal reconciliation with other crewmates in the context of the larger picture at hand. Classic. So it's reconciliation of conflict, internal, external, alien, and even hierarchical power, needs of the one, needs of the many, within a framework of personal ethics, within a chain of command. Very enterprising. Star Trek Discovery doesn't jump the shark, so to speak, but reaches into novelty with interspecies transhumanism mixing and matching. Yeah, boundary pushing, cool. Not sure about the tardigrades lawsuit, but whatevs. I recall reading about tardigrades in a magazine called Science Now when I was about 12. Altered Carbon did that transhumanism thing too, and The Expanse has much better political intrigue, something for everyone. Anyway, yeah, ratings, an early warning sign. How can I not mention Rick and Morty? And The Orville is now the new Star Trek. That's a bit too kooky for my liking. Too on the nose, while the acting is so cardboard. No one chewing it up there. So I just actually realised why I'm more a Trekkie fan than Orville. Star Trek was always about the kind of greater good, the effects or the needs of the many. But Star Trek Discovery seems much more individualistic in terms of the frame of context. It's not what Star Trek used to be, but what the Orville is. Yeah, I just kind of realised that. Probably why I'm not enamoured with either, because it's all about, the focus on the individual. Maybe my left leanings are coming out. Yeah, so, political identity. Let's skip that. So, yeah, Orbits, back to the story. Orbits was out. It was 1999. And Eisner, according to Iger, was running hot and cold and more isolated. And this was covered at length in Stewart's book, Disney Wars. Eisner seemed to be trapped in a kind of no-win, kind of Kobayashi Maru. I couldn't resist. Bad decisions, rather than admitted, were doubled down on. The refusal to pay Katzenberg, the ousting of dissenting board members, the lack of clarity regarding Orbits and his position, the bungled corporate structure, the refusal to resolve Pixar's issues, and the length executives were going to avoid each other on a daily basis was ridiculous. It's just the Disney Wars book paints it more or less like a schoolyard thing where the frightened kids hide around the corner from each other because they just don't want to have the conflict. Bizarre. Then paranoia sets in, they start spying on each other, controlling information flows, avoiding meetings. Ridiculous. I've seen it though, I've been there, and I can tell you how it starts. It starts with a little lie that goes like this. I know. It doesn't even have to be said out loud, but the inference that you know something you don't, and then for a big decision to be based on or made on, that claim carries a very heavy tax. The company will be destroyed before the admission of ignorance. Seen it. Hence the title of this chapter, Know What You Don't Know, which ironically is ambiguous and has a double meaning, doesn't it? So one thing that sticks out in Iger's book is where Tom had a meeting with Eisner. Actually, this might have been from Disney Wars. I can't remember. Doesn't matter. But where Eisner revealed to Tom that he would never make Iger the number 2. And so Tom called Iger to let him know immediately. And this he let Iger know on Iger's first night of a long overdue vacation with his wife. And I was left puzzling as to why he would choose that timing to do that. Because if he was on holiday, what's he going to do? Cancel his holiday and come back? Or is he going to be worrying about it while he's on holiday? But I figured Iger would want to know bad news sooner. I think that was the case. But what to do? Except think about it while on holiday. And this is another thing that comes through in the book, the ability to compartmentalize information, to put boundary boxes around things. This again is something that's quite well explored in series like Scandal. The thing that came through from Scandal with me is that you can do bad things, and you can do bad things to friends, and the friendship will survive if it was a real friendship. And I kind of squirm a little bit like that because he's getting a bit close to those kind of toxic relationships. I'm not sure we should be normalising that kind of behaviour. So as we know, and skipping a chunk of the story, our man Iger was made president, COO and board member of Disney. See, when you tell it like this, it's just matter of fact, it's just flat. And I'm seeing this pattern in Iger's book of he really hams it up. He makes it entertaining. He does an excellent job of jacking up retention. But, we're not here for the drama, but the structure is not lost on me. It follows the Disney formula quite well. And so with that, chapter 4 of Iger's book starts off with backstory. You know how this goes. What's after the backstory in the Disney formula? Oh, that's right, the inciting incident sets the plot in motion. So let's carry on. So the backstory, Walt Disney, he set it all up. He did okay in its golden years. Like I say, Fantasia, it was a spectacle, innovation of a time, breakout technologies. Then things slid. Walt died in 1966. Disney were very concerned with keeping an undiluted brand. In 1983, a couple of corporate raids were attempted. Profits were down 25%. Here we are, Gary Vee strategy, buy an undervalued asset and run your own IP through it. Same old, nothing changes. The new. Corporate raiders were trying to get hold of Disney, but proved unsuccessful. So Eisner was brought in, and Katzenberg eventually, and they turned things around. Call me simple-minded, but their strategy here seemed to be raising ticket prices on the theme parks. Okay. Value pricing is a critical strategy, and the story of Concorde always gets me. They undersold that for years, and it was only when they asked the executive how much they thought the tickets were that they raised prices, because it turned out that the people actually flying on the plane, the executives being flown, were not the ones who were actually booking the tickets. They just, told their PA or their secretaries, get me a flight on Concorde. And they didn't even ask how much it cost. And when they actually asked the executives how much they thought it cost, turns out their estimate of what they thought it cost was about 5 times what the actual ticket price was. So they put the price up. Yeah, a really good book on this is Value Pricing by Baker. I might go through that as well. It's a really good read. So what else? Yeah, what else did the newly Eisner do? Well, yeah, VHS was invented. And they realised they could leverage their IP and sell video cassettes. And that generated $1 billion business. Now, call me crazy, but, well, maybe it seems simple in retrospect. In fact, as pointed out in Disney Wars, the huge lift in 1987 in Disney profitability came from just 3 sources: raising admission prices at the theme parks, expanding the number of company-owned hotels, and distributing the animated classics on home video. Not rocket science, but, well, nice easy moves. Yeah, then in 95, the Cap Cities ABC acquisition brought with that 100 million subscribers. Yet another business model. And borrow money, set up a YouTube account, churn out quality episodes, get 4 million subscribers and sell it to a TV company. It's the eyeballs, you see. It's the subscribers. You got to get the eyeballs. And remember, when buying eyeballs, you must divide by 2. There's only one body per 2 eyeballs. Eisner was responsible for Disney Studios, parks and resorts, while Iger eventually got media, networks and consumer products and international. Iger does pay a lot of respect to Eisner. He says Eisner helped him see in new ways. That's the key. It's what the visitor's experience, it's what the designer's eye sees. What are the critical questions? And so, kind of way back before all this, as Disney World itself was opened, Walt Disney would watch the guests and their behaviour through the park. And he made the calculation that waste bins need to be no more than 30 feet from each other, as was the needs of the ambulating guests. Research, needs discovery, solution development. So the research and development arm of Disney, referred to as Imagineering, gets a lot of respect from Iger. And there's insight. Eisner could see the big picture and the details. And this theme comes through on other projects that I read about. The Matrix films, for example. The Wachowskis storyboarded every last detail, did a thorough job. They even insisted that the cast got martial arts training, that they had to read Baudrillard's work. That's a tough book to read. Same with Alien. And The Fifth Element, I learned, was 12 years in the making. And here, perhaps as a clue, Eisner was a micromanager. Iger, to a point, agrees the details matter, but the big picture has to work. He understood that great is often a collection of very small things, so something not to be overlooked. And a few funny details are in the book, as when Eisner described to the press his level of involvement in those small details. It seems absurd for the CEO of Disney to be talking about the lampshades he either designed or picked out for the hotels. Yeah, do it. Just don't make a big Trump. Just don't make a big deal of it. What was his latest ramblings? No one uses the internet as sophisticatedly as Donald Trump. Then came Apple. I never really got Apple. I recall in my younger years, we went the Atari way, and it was more function over form. I got the details, I understood the mechanics, I learned assembly language. The looks and the sleek curves were less important to me than clock speed, 6502 chips, and later 68000 series Motorola's. Memory size and MIPS stats were where I was at. I didn't care what shade the box came in, I never got it, still don't. It still amazes me how Nvidia beat AMD in the GPU wars. AMD was technically a superior product, but Nvidia won the marketing. And as far as I can tell, it was a small decision way back when. Well, actually, a few small decisions that made them great. It's an interesting case study. I forget a lot of the details, but back in the day, there wasn't a lot of use for household GPU compute units or graphics coprocessor cards. The early versions were really dedicated graphics cards to help the games lift frame rate with a dedicated math coprocessors required for texture mapping, geometry, 3D vectoring, and all those kind of things. God blimey, DirectX 2. That's how long ago. 3DFX Voodoo cards, anyone? So again, here at the same time, again, one of those confluence points. There's a thing called SETI at Home, been knocking around for a little bit, which is a small project that allowed people with an internet connection to download radio telescope signals and process those signals looking for non-natural signal, i.e. artificial signals in the noise of what radio telescopes were picking up from deep space. This is actually quite intensive for computers to do, and that's why they created this distributed model where home users could download the information and process it on their home computers. So, if you've got 20,000 people doing this, 20,000 computers running this task. Brilliant. So people started to dedicate idle CPU time. Basically, it came in a screensaver format. When your PC was idle, screensaver was come on, SETI at Home would kick up, it would automatically download a signal, a small portion of a signal, and process it, send it back up to the main server at SETI at Home, and you'd get a credit for it. Then groups formed, and then leaderboards were made for those with the most number of signals processed. This was incentive. And then it became a competition. And then people started buying computers just to run this on. And then the boffins realized that math coprocessors in these graphics cards would accelerate these computations if we could work out how to make use of these so-called stream processors, or what later became known in NVIDIA's case as CUDA processors. But the programming languages for parallel processing at the time were not so well known, and very different in structure to, the languages of the day. So what would that have been? Modular 2 had fallen out of fashion by then. Pascal had gone by the wayside. So it was more C++, Delphi, that kind of thing. .NET hadn't come out yet. Yeah, so these specific implementations of parallel processing in terms of requirements for coders was not well known, and the specific implementation for the hardware was a little bit more obscure than it is now. So the team at SETI at Home asked each of the graphics card companies to write for them an implementation of the SETI at Home software so that it would actually run on these graphics cards, on the parallel processing part of the graphics cards, rather than at the time single or dual core CPUs. AMD told them to piss off and write their own. Nvidia says, yes, we'll write that for you. And they did. So if you were running SETI at Home on a computer that had an Nvidia graphics card in it, you rocketed to the top of those leaderboards. Later, some projects were converted for AMD, but it seemed to be a bit of a hack job from what I remember. Some of them worked really well. The Colas conjecture ran really well on AMD cards, as did a project called Mu. So yeah, Nvidia capitalized on that lead ever since, because it was the graphics card of choice if you wanted to do SETI at Home projects. And, a lot of processing on SETI at Home was done. Then along came Bitcoin, and cryptocurrencies. And then you just didn't get credit on a leaderboard anymore for doing SETI at Home number crunching. If you were doing Bitcoin or cryptocurrency number crunching, you actually got something you could convert into cash. And I recall cranking up my GPUs to work on the cryptocurrencies. Very fortuitous. That turned out to be really good timing. Total luck. There we are. But, so this is what it was. The cost of developing that kooky bit of SETI at home software that gave NVIDIA a lead that AMD have forever seemed to be able to struggle to catch up with. And now I'm going to say, what did that cost? Probably 3 months development time. The primary code base was already there. All NVIDIA had to do was parallelize it. Opportunity. And the AMD driver software at the time was shocking as well. Maybe things have changed. And, AMD certainly come back with its Ryzen CPUs, which have kicked Intel in the ass. But NVIDIA is stomping all over the compute market with brilliant marketing. Folks nowadays not on a SETI at home, not on Bitcoin anymore, but on artificial intelligence, deep learning, and all that heavy maths stuff. And they're charging a premium for it as well. All good for NVIDIA. Yeah, just a side note, but AMD, tricky position because they're competing for the CPU market and they're also in the GPU market. So they're kind of taking on Intel and NVIDIA. And they're not doing bad, actually. They're not doing bad at all. Those Ryzen chips, wow. Apple, back in the day, I thought, very expensive. They certainly charged a premium for the brand. And I recall at least one girlfriend along the way bought me an Apple iPlayer, the video one. Well, I had a small Sony laptop that was faster, played all the videos and music and emails and internet, and was only slightly more expensive. I'll admit, the smaller iPod was convenient. Mass appeal. Though I'd still have an Android over Apple and a PC over a McMuffin or whatever they're called. It took me ages to understand. And it turns out apparently I'm a bit of a geek. And the story was really rammed home reading about how the Sony Walkman came to be. So at the time, the early prototypes were built and they could play and record. And the extra cost for the record function was only about $2 per unit. I think it might only have been $1, it might have been less than $2, but minimal amount. And the head honcho said, no, remove the record function. Apparently he knew that this added feature would cause confusion in the marketplace. People would ask, what is this device? Is it for playback? Or is it a dictaphone? Do we record music with it? What do we do with it? So the way the story is told, it was to be purposed for one single function. Clarity on function, not clever multifunctional things. And besides, I also learned that import tariffs for electronics that have a record function makes such products more expensive to the end purchaser, who won't necessarily even use that function. So again, clarity beats clever. And the story of Apple is just as interesting. And Atari, as it happens, also felt the influence of Steve Jobs. A story for another time. But in this story, Jobs is intersectional in the guise of Pixar. And a time before GPUs and dedicated graphics rendering workstations or render farms were available. Enter Toy Story. So the first fully CGI film, I noticed Iger didn't mention Tron, an earlier Disney film venture, and another technical threshold breakout. Breakout. For those who don't know, this is how Steve Jobs got started at Atari. He was asked to improve a game of the same name. One of the first video games, not Pong, but Breakout. How appropriate. NVIDIA all over again. One small obligation fulfilled was his insert into that market. So after Toy Story, Pixar followed tremendous success with A Bug's Life, Monsters Incorporated, and I really enjoyed Bug's Life, and that was another bedtime VHS to fall asleep to. Or the other one, Ants, produced by DreamWorks, SK for Katzenberg, G. Yeah, leaving that one alone and moving on. Here though is a little bit of slyness on the side of Disney. One might say generously, it's excellent business practice, astute shrewdness, prudent even. So Pixar was a startup at the time, and Disney had the leverage in this venture. This was a joint venture between Disney and Pixar to produce 5 films. Under this arrangement, Disney retained the intellectual property and sequel rights. See what they did there? They outsourced the risk to a startup studio. Had it gone wrong, Pixar would be the one carrying a Chapter 11 rather than a huge loss for Disney. And Disney kept the rights and therefore could control the film production. control is everything. Ownership, a distant second. That's where the liabilities are. Be a grantor beneficiary and tell a trustee to get on with their fucking job. Those public servants, politicians, are trustees. We are the grantor and beneficiary. We tell them, and we're not anyway. So this arrangement was insightful in respect of risk mitigation. Spin it off to an eager startup, let them swallow it up. Nowadays, this seems modus operandi, where anyone who wears jeans and a black polo neck sweater is declared competent to wield multi-billion-dollar investments. Hopefully, WeWork and SoftBank will end this practice, as I reckon this is going to sting investors. Well, that's the big sell, though, isn't it? SoftBank got all this risk on their book, and they're going to resell that risk, likely to those least able to spot that risk, are likely also to be those least competent to handle it. Yes, to you, to me, to us, the dear public. Yep, the fabled IPO, booyah! Except not in this case. WeWork is not a tech company. But this is the model to get rich, and I mean really fucking rich. So take, for example, a large multinational institution like NASA, or the UK Space Agency maybe. I'm not so sure how the UK research and innovation model works, but it's certainly true for NASA, where vast sums of taxpayer money are pumped in. Now, no, the flat earthers are quick to bemoan the $50 million a day that funds NASA, whatevs. But in the case of NASA, they have invented the technology behind so many products we take for granted. NASA does not sell these products nor manufacture them directly. No, the taxpayer funded massive R&D via NASA. And after that risk is absorbed by the taxpayer, the technology and knowledge is passed to the private sector so they can make profit, selling proven technology back to those who funded its risky development in the first place. This just leaves us with one issue: how to convince the taxpayer that we need something like NASA. Well, comrades, need I say further than that? Yeah, we invent things like the space race. We create the bogeyman that justifies the very existence of the proposition. This is a justification of a presupposed need. It's the trustee telling the beneficiary what they need so that the grantor can mandate the trustee. It's all wrong. Of course, the problem is the grantor beneficiary doesn't actually know what's possible. Like, no one knew they needed the iPhone before the iPhone was invented. And even now, all that consumers really know is better, faster, cheaper. The innovators, of course, being literally ahead of the curve, which is no doubt a reference to the early and late majority hump in the middle of that curve before the laggards, diffusion of innovation and all that. So it's far, far easier to motivate the masses through a perception and emotional response than cool hard logic. Ain't no one got time for that, and besides, we don't want the proletariat thinking for themselves. This is how it's done. Humans are easier to fool and to convince them that they've been fooled. Lots of reasons for this, and it's to do with things like saving face, hypocrisy, and the refusal to admit, I don't know. Other reasons: people are too busy trying to pay the mortgage, having a second job, bringing up the kids, the important and immediately relatable stuff. But they also make decisions based on the information at hand. Sensible. And what other way of doing that kind of thing is there? We follow the crowd, we do what those people around us are doing, and that's how the slippery slope to radicalisation starts, with a suspension of critical examination from the start. Another reason is the limited time most people have for research and critical analysis, and it's deliberately crippled, I think, so people make decisions based on the propaganda at hand. It's the loudest voices that get heard, not those with actual good arguments. So, just watch any political debate show. It's the squeaky wheel that gets the attention, not necessarily the one with the best arguments. And it is a show, and let's walk through an example. I mean, I'm gathering you're a sophisticated viewer, and you probably can already see this, probably have already seen it. So a man, he's running for office, let's say the highest office, president. Let's say he's Harvard educated and from a very rich family. And let's say he's insulated from working for a living. What to do to make him relatable to the working class electorate? Well, his PR team suggests he buys a farm or a ranch, which he does because he's rich. And then the PR machine positions him as a farmer, a down-to-earth rancher. Good old USA. Shit, it's apple pie. How much goodwill and sway has he just bought? When the electorate don't have time to do full due diligence and follow through all the political argumentation and policies and implications thereof, they, we, us, you, me, I, go from signifiers, indicators, virtues or archetypes, familiarity. It's marketing 101. I can identify with the rancher or farm boy. I know that story. I know those people, and by proxy, I have an understanding of what that archetype is about. And compared to the other candidates who waffle on about something called gross domestic product and employment rates or quantitative easing and universal basic income, the homegrown farmer boy is much more familiar, especially if he's also served in the military. He's a goddamn national hero. And by inference and proxy, he has the national interest at heart. Standard operating procedure, my friends. This is the PragerU playbook, except they add in the victim card too, fuckers. And they stir up the pot, keep us fighting among ourselves, and ask us, the working classes, to fight their fucking wars for them. So, for example, one I recently watched was about the regulations that stifle small businesses. Sounds good, because odds are you are a small business owner or work for one, and yeah, all those regulations can be burdensome for one person or a small business. But the star of this particular PragerU video is a man who runs an international corporation masquerading as a small struggling business owner who has attempted to motivate people to fight his fight for him. Because, what? He can't afford to? Or he has insufficient resources to do so? And so is enlisting our help on these false pretenses that he too is a struggling small business owner just like you. And if it's important to him, it's important to you, then vote to deregulise. Deregulate. It's a class war. Well, we're getting way off target here. I just wanted to get that off my chest. Anyway, so yeah, from the point of view of the PR people who played this trick, you can imagine how they come to the conclusion that we, the electorate, the public, are dumb. It looks that way. It looks as though we were so easily manipulated or sold, but that judgment, that conclusion in itself is dumb and dangerous. They, the PR people, the politicians, the bougie, start believing it. We recognise the insult. They do not. We have no access to mass media and can't effectively tell them what twats they're being, except at the next election cycle when the other fella gets in, upon which the PR people working for that person will no doubt pat themselves on the back as a job well done. It's easy to see how this can lead to contempt, and what follows from there is never good. Fool me once, you shame. Fool me twice, blame who? Can't quite recall exactly how Bush put that, but the irony is penetrating. It's not that the electorate were sold or even persuaded necessarily, it's just one option was made to look more familiar, and if choosing the lesser of evils is how this works, then I have to really think about how the political engine is working and ask, is that really the best that governments can do for the people for whom it's supposed to serve? Realistically, pragmatically, yeah, it seems that's where we are. But shit, ask people if we should be spending billions on space travel, or whether we should use that money to fix problems on Earth. And, well, let me ask, what are those inventions that NASA's R&D produced? Do you even know? Would now be a good time to list them all? Or should I just raise the flag and say, yeah, we beat the commies and leave it at that? I'm not even convinced that the Ruskies were racing anything, that they were just doing their own thing. It was the other side that framed it as a race, and out of that, NASA was born. Iger also talks about the relationship between Eisner and Steve Jobs, and I think Eisner may have misread Jobs by the accounts offered in this book. Jobs certainly seems to have a reputation for cold hard business decisions, and it seems that Eisner was interacting more to the letter of the law, to the specifics of the contract. There was no, or not a lot of interpersonal play described, seemingly unaware or uncaring of Steve's feelings, as Iger says. At the time, Toy Story 2 became a bit of a battle. It did well and became a matter of contractual controversy. One party was arguing that it should count as a production in the 5-movie deal. The other saying, nah, it doesn't count because it's a sequel. there's a funny old thing about negotiations. It's not what's said. I mean, maybe I'm naive and in retrospect it's easy, but just suppose you've worked with a company that's just created $1.5 billion in value in a couple of years working together like these two just have. I don't know what I'd be arguing about particularly, but perhaps this is the power play and machinations that go on, and why these top executives get paid the big brass to see that, okay, it's 1.5 billion today, but next decade that's going to amount to $20 billion, and that's worth a fight now. So I kind of do see the necessity to keep a respectful prickliness, with this kind of big money at stake. A bank seeing that kind of growth would be pleased, I'm sure, to issue either side a lot of debt to buy out the other and secure their big fat fee, but that's from a place of suspicion and paranoia and perhaps even insecurity. So, as Elvis said, we can't go on with suspicious minds, although I preferred Waylon Jennings in Jesse Coulter's version. The drums at the end of that track build up to the inevitable crescendo of what it's like when suspicious minds take over the situation. It's a classic in tone. Take a listen and notice how the pace slows in moments of tenderness and appeal to better judgment, and then how the percussion builds up as the advice is not heeded. Caught in a trap, the voices can barely be heard for the drums. It's a brilliant metaphor. A lesson hard learned, mind you, and as a few business gurus say, you're asking the wrong questions. Focusing on what could go wrong and how it might go wrong is the wrong way of doing it. Presume it will go well, focus on that, and know that if it goes wrong, you have the capacity, fortitude and resources to fix it. But you do not know what that might be, and worrying about it won't change it, and there's such a thing as overpaying for insurance. The twists and turns described in Disney Wars lists things that were not on anyone's radar. The chance meeting, an email sent to the wrong department, helicopter crashes, cultural clashes, geopolitical incidents, at least with bad weather and recessions, those are coming eventually. And the thing that comes through is an old adage, make hay while the sun shines, speed is king, don't hang about, take a shit or get off the pot. As Pixar's reputation and influence grew with each release, so did the tension with Disney. In Jobs' mind, he and Pixar deserved more respect from Disney, and he wanted the contract to reflect the shift in leverage. This seems at first glance trivial, even selfish, but actually I think there's a deeper appreciation of equity rather than just commercial greed. There's a huge difference. This is the sentiments I pick up from Iger's description of Jobs. I've not read any books on Steve Jobs. Apparently Fassbender did a good take on Jobs' mannerisms in that film. But what comes through from the book is that Jobs thought, because they were eclipsing Disney both in creativity and commercial success, that Disney should have turned to them, Pixar, for creative assistance. Instead, he felt that Eisner always treated them as a lesser partner in the relationship, as a studio for hire, which he took as a huge slight. Eisner, it seemed, felt equally disrespected. He and others at Disney believed that they were much more just than silent partners in the creation of the films, and that Jobs never gave Disney the credit it deserved. Here we are, two titans of industry bickering about, it's this whole thing about relationships, isn't it? Husband and wife, and the breakdown. It's so funny because it's so simple. So you have this thing in relationships where the husband thinks he's doing 70% of the housework, and the wife thinks she's doing 70% of the housework, because what the other does is just not visible to the other party. So they always assume they're carrying the bulk of the weight, but it's just not so. It's just that, this is simple marriage counsellor guidance stuff. Yeah, here it's being played out with billions of dollars at stake. Yeah, so convincing people that, they're not actually doing 70% of the work, to come back to that expression again about humans being easier to fool, and to convince them that they've been fooled, even if they're fooling themselves. I can't help but think of the obviousness of the situation. If these accounts in this book are accurate, well, consider a question in litigation where the defendant wins the case. Should they be awarded costs? I think the statistics are something like 90% of people say yes, of course. Question 2. You feel you have a claim, go to court and lose. Should you pay the defendant's cost? Same question. Our survey says 44%. Yeah, and I know you felt a twinge because I did. Yeah, you got to suck that one up. So it's really easy to ask these questions from a position that's not emotionally invested. Are these two on about making bigger pies together, or are they on about slicing up that pie in different ways? That's choice. Iger wasn't involved at all in the Pixar relationship, but noticed it was clear that Pixar was gaining swagger as Disney was losing it. Iger frames this as two strong-willed personalities destined to battle each other for supremacy. I'm sure that's a very Disney way of looking at it. It's a contrived conflict, but reasoning Disney wars, I don't think it was like that. It does present a question about how to resolve conflict, though. So suppose one of the parties has an excellent economical argument to do X, but suppose the other has a belief in self so strong that not X is the way. Is this really a battle of wills, or belligerence, or an unwilling to admit to self? One says to do it because logic and reason are fine and say this is a clear decision, and the other one says, no, I'm not doing it because it doesn't feel right. They're using two different evaluation systems. So anyway, Iger concludes this was the state of affairs up to and around 2001. What Iger also does not point out is what Disney was doing in the 1990s in respect of revamping a lot of its old movies. They were updating them, bringing them more in line with modern sensibilities. One might argue a little bit of historic revisionism. So this is the thing with such a huge corporation. Typical of any corporation searching for the business model. Mistakes will be made, some good, some bad, and some ugly, all in public view. So it's easy to criticise, and it's easy to bring this up. White slave traders. Yeah, it's a cheap shot. By the way, in respect to the book, and in accordance with the Disney film structure, I think we're at the first point of attack where conflict is first introduced, the Disney-Pixar showdown. But before we get to that, revisionism and the updating of hand-drawn animations to CGI and live-action remakes that went on in the 90s. Sure, innovative though. Well, this is what Gary Vee was on about. Run your IP through new assets, new acquisitions. Test the waters with a third-party startup to minimise the downside risk. Keep control of the IP and equity. See how it goes. And of course, and I'm sure it's at the back of Eisner's mind, buy the asset if it turns out to be a winner. It's a kind of try before you buy deal. Shrewd, and of course, if you can get away with it. Trouble is, I suspect Jobs didn't appreciate it as a partner. And because it's in my mind, having recently completed the Futurama binge watch, check out Season 1, Episode 2. It makes reference to Fungineers, a clear poke. The episode describes a trip to the moon, which is a luxury trip for Fry, who has yet to adjust to the new boundary conditions of his new reality, but it's a mundane trip for the rest of the crew. And on that moon, they attend a theme park where much of the origins of man's efforts to first land on the moon have been twisted, misrepresented, simplified, or brushed over. Creationist arc thing. Was it all well said? Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Now I get Futurama is poking a bit of fun, but not just at Disney, it's also social commentary. We know a lot of stories upon which Disney classics are based are stories on stories on stories, and that times change, and there has to be this kind of constant updating. Yeah, I get that. It's a tricky one. You want to stay relevant, updated for the times, meet the market where they are. The consequence is a kind of revisionism. The buyer is also complicit. That's what I never really got about Disney, the fakery. Which seems an astonishing thing to say. Of course it's fakery. It's the land of fantasy. It was my mistake in the assumption that there was any truth to it at all. And I can't point the finger at Disney for that fault. I point this out in the context of an outgoing CEO writing his memoirs, as it were. He too, in this case, will have information availability bias. And many judgments and opinions will be offered only on the basis of what he knew for sure, what he thought he knew, and it will be absent of the things that he obviously didn't know, or maybe things that he pretended to know. It's a tempting, slippery slope to fill in the gaps and fit a narrative that fits with only the facts that you have at hand. But there's no question Disneyland is popular. The appeal to the fantasy, the augmented life, the fake life. These are things concerning to me. Why is this escape needed? Because life itself is so shit? Or have I missed something? I get it. I know, being kissed awake by a rich prince, happy ever after, the everyday fight can be so very tiring. utilise everything. Reboot, revamp, extend, leverage, cannibalise, even parody your own stuff. Wring every last drop of value out of those assets. And even Disney themselves have become meta, commenting on their own productions, something I saw in Hercules. And I loved it. It's a gracious acknowledgement that they know that we know that they know we're complicit in the crimes against humanity together. Consider again the film Saving Mr. Banks and the issue of artistic integrity, Travers selling out value for price. And remember that scene in Mary Poppins where the small boy asks, "Please may we feed the birds?" A question of helping the needy and less fortunate, or keeping money with the bankers. That was not in the book. Again, to tell a good story, there is this need to widen or deepen the conflicts, to denigrate the norm, sell the dream, ramp up the potential loss if you don't take action, confirm the advantages if you do, sweeten the deal, go on. Imagine a smile on your kid's face. You wouldn't want them to be the only ones in their school who misses out. What kind of parent does that? Unloving ones, that's who. You love your kids, don't you? Of course you do. So why not make it VIP then, so your kids have the best stories to market to their friends, to tell their friends when they get back. Yes, get back, a nice unconscious installation, one that the listener has to imagine to make sense of the sentence. You can almost see your kids there at Disneyland, in it, even if you don't have kids. Plot contrivances. Added to a story to carry narrative. Be careful. The actions of our main characters will have to navigate around those contrivances, and out of necessity for the plot, that will mean them taking an action completely out of character. I don't even need to say it, do I? In another film, Saving Mr. Banks, where the story of the making of Mary Poppins is told, at the end, Travers is depicted as attending the premiere, at which it is suggested she finally cries. This is not from any reconciliation or releasing of tension, but because her creation had been sold, taken, changed, altered forever, and would never be hers again. The parallels to Star Wars is just... Yeah, I'm sure Lucas was not joking, when he made the comment about selling his kids to white slave owners. I can't keep a straight face and say it. I know it was taken out of context, but that's kind of like what he was getting at. It's like giving away your kids, and you generally don't ever sell your kids. Yeah, to him, that's what it felt like, I guess. Anyway, then progressing the story of the book, September the 11th happened. And the ripple effects were, as we know, calamitous. Financial firms were affected, rich investors started selling off stock, margin calls were made, and stock prices slumped. Who could have predicted that? Yeah, Sid Bass didn't, and he was exposed to a massive margin call, which forced him to sell massive amounts of Disney stock. This isn't in Iger's book, but Sid Bass was a huge backer of Eisner and a large block Disney stockholder, and thus a silent power base for Eisner, except no longer. Yep, that was one of those events, worse than anything anyone would dare to imagine or conjure up as being a potential threat or anything to be worried about. These things just, have worry, have anxiety, but no, it doesn't help. Iger uses this as a jumping off point to make mention that Eisner's paranoia and anxieties were increasing. Yeah, perhaps Eisner saw the shifting sands and innovation coming up, and the massive and incredible growth of tech firms in that era, Microsoft, Apple, Pixar, and perhaps he saw his own demise on a hospital bed, commenting on how things are not what they used to be. It reminds me of a nice little film called Micromen, a story of Sinclair, the British inventor. And at the end of that film, we see Clive Sinclair in his C5 driving down, it looks like an airport runway, but I think it's supposed to be a road. But he's being passed by a very large truck with the branding of Hewlett-Packard or IBM on the side of the truck, just to give some comparisons between the real juggernauts of industry and a kind of kooky inventor. Big changes. Yeah, and a word to the wise on this anxiety and pessimism. Never share a doubt. I've kind of come to learn that this is part of accepting the big bucks. That's what that money is supposed to help with. It turns out Eisner had plenty of valid reasons to be pessimistic, but as a leader you can't communicate that pessimism to the people around you. It's ruinous to morale. It saps energy and inspirations. Decisions then get made from protective defensive postures, and it seems Eisner's latter years at Disney took on this posture. This is very much more detailed in Disney Wars than in Iger's book. But Eisner's natural pessimism often worked for him up to a point. He was motivated in part out of a fear for calamity, and that often fueled his perfectionism and his success. Although it's not a very useful tool to motivate people, sometimes his concerns were justified. And reading around a bit more, Eisner seemed to be falling out with everyone. I can imagine it must be very difficult. They say it's lonely at the top, I would never know, but to hold such a position means having incredible self-belief. But where is that line drawn, if it's a line at all, across which contempt for anyone else is the kind of heuristic? So, if it's any use, it may be useful to know that even random actions that have limited quanta are settled to predictable outcomes. And this is kind of a fancy way of saying that, supposing you're in a busy city and you have to go somewhere and you have to get on a bus to get there. Now, the buses come every 2 minutes and you've got an hour to get there. It doesn't really matter which of the next 5 or 6 buses you get on, you're going to get there at the time regardless. So whether one bus is late or whether another one that's supposed to arrive after it arrives before it due to some quirk in traffic flow, these are the random fluctuations, but they have quanta. That is to say, there are hard edges to these randomness that result in the almost inevitable outcome. At one time there will be a bus going to where you want to get to. That is to say, the butterfly effect doesn't always have that outcome because there are hard stops that, like what they call in quantum physics, energy potentials, energy wells, and some can be gotten over, some can be tunneled through, some just require too much energy to make that jump. It's just not possible. This is why glass is transparent, by the way. Anyway, in his later years, as Eisner's stress levels seemed to increase, pessimism became the rule more than the exception, and it led him to close ranks and become increasingly cloistered. Iger notes Eisner was under incredible stress and adds optimism in a leader, especially in challenging times, is so vital. Pessimism leads to paranoia, which leads to defensiveness, which leads to risk aversion. Yeah, and you tend not to share information then, because if you're in an environment of paranoia, you think anything you can say can be used against you. So the whole thing seizes up. Optimism sets a different machine in motion, especially in difficult moments. The people you lead need to feel confident in your ability to focus on what matters and not to operate from a place of defensiveness and self-preservation. This isn't about saying things are good when they're not, and it's not about conveying some innate faith that things will work out. I think that's just as bad. I think rather than saying something like, oh, don't worry, things will work out, it might be better to say, that's a problem, let's write that down on a list, let's get some people to work on it, and let's work it through. What do you need to get it done? Who else can help? It's about believing you and the people around you can steer towards the best outcome, and not communicating the feeling that all is lost if things don't break your way. The tone, this is what I talked about, tone at length, you set as a leader has an enormous effect on the people around you. No one wants to follow a pessimist. I think that's a really important lesson. Set the tone. So you've almost got to come to the office with a plan for the day to anticipate what people might be doing, thinking or saying. And then, I hate to put the expression, but not to spin it, but to have reasonably well planned anticipatory responses to what's likely to come up for that day. And it's of the few successful people I've met along the way, it's those who are not afraid to engage and communicate. The real special ones also have a magic bag of tricks that seem to be able to fix almost any problems. They've been there, they've done that at least twice. In this magic bag, there's almost a grounded confidence. It's evidential, it's experience backed. It's not that other kind of pretending to know what you just ain't so. And what's in that magic bag of tricks? Mostly is a knowledge that calm and relaxed engagement of all parties is key to problem solving. Tension and confusion and conflict are good for stories, but not good for making good decisions. So the ability of these leaders to calm people down, diffuse a sense of confidence, and to bring focus and clarity to bear on a situation. But in the book, Iger obviously wants to tell a compelling story, so he's really hamming up the narrative, and he widens this tension that Eisner's experiencing by pointing out that Eisner was hired by Roy Disney, who was keeper of the Disney traditions and legacies. He revered the past instead of respecting it. and he had issues with change. And that sentiment tainted his view of acquisitions. This is Roy. Roy wasn't a big fan of acquisitions. It, in his mind, diluted the blood. Moving on. What did I mean brand? Anyway, Iger points out that there was one instance that Eisner had where Mickey Mouse was used in the wrong colours in some merchandising operation, and he kind of lost his rag with it. I mean, yeah, I guess, Mickey Mouse is the icon, so perhaps not screw with that. And there's a couple more things that Iger points out about Eisner, which I don't really understand the point of, can't see it having relevance, and are a little bit more of a private matter and serve little use to put in the public domain. So perhaps as a clue, in the film Saving Mr. Banks, Tom Hanks plays Walt Disney, but in the film we never see the character of Walt Disney actually smoking, but subtle clues are there. The cough, the stubbing out of a cigarette just obscured by a foreground object. It's just enough to leave us so that we can work it out, but it was actually explicitly prohibited. So Eisner's vice wasn't smoking, it was the other one. I've known people to drink to take the edge off, some drink to put the edge on. I'm kind of ambivalent to it, but I do recall traders were not allowed to drink and return to the trading floor. Something about impaired judgment. But I had to laugh because sometimes too much analysis and judgment was also paralysing. So, like I say, I'm not really sure why Iger mentioned this. It's a strange one to put in the book, especially in light of recent things. Anyway, once the rift appears, and as we've learned from Rosenberg and confirmed from Dweck, once that fixed mindset sets in and communication freezes up and people stop negotiating, contempt soon follows. Seldom salvageable, and at that point it's time to think about severance and separation sooner rather than later. There's a warning here, I think, that we need to accommodate an emotional space for difficult conversations, both in respect of instigating them and recognising the need to be accepting of others instigating these kinds of conversations that require our participation. We just can't shy away from it. But just don't open with a judgment. Refer back to Dweck or Rosenberg. Are you feeling? Because. Anyway, in this story, some members of the board pointed out in a letter to Eisner the problems, though this was orchestrated in a very bizarre way. These board members were resigning and cited the reasons why, which was a list of complaints about what had gone wrong. Kind of always struck me as a strange way of doing things, that to start meaningful talks you have to first resign. I thought it'd be better to do it the other way around, but it seems like he just wouldn't listen or wouldn't take heed, or these 2 or 3 board members were marginalised. Anyway, this is it though. How do you get engagement? How do you get through when people won't listen? No one cares until everyone cares. And a board member's resignation in protest does make people take notice. Stockholders, shareholders, the news, corporations, and then that affects share price, and then a lot of people suddenly start to care. But sometimes in sales, though, blowing up the sale first and quickly can be a tactic, followed by the useful phrase, "Now that I've blown the deal, could I just ask?" And the tension is released, and the questions can start again now, but from a place of honesty without the need for covert or oblique or diplomatic responses. It lets off the pressure and provides a space for honesty, thought and reflection rather than defence, rebuttal and refutations. Under these circumstances, it's easier for both sides to admit, "I don't know." So what were the complaints from the board members? ABC's rating issues, micromanagement by Eisner, lack of adequate investment in the parks, stakeholder perceptions, brain drain, poor partner relationships, Pixar, refusal to establish succession plans. I'm also reading another book on merger and acquisitions, and this paragraph seemed to fit right in here, particularly in regard to on succession. So this book was written by the son. Dad pulled back from his industry and did not attend trade association meetings for countless years. Isolated and withdrawn, he lived in the past and could not imagine how to deal with changing circumstances. His key advisor was an old family attorney, even more removed from the world of current trends and out of touch with the needs of a succession strategy. Again, this is the author. My heartfelt advice to all business owners is replete throughout the pages of this book. It is essential that business owners address the topic of succession planning with earnest and focus. Fulfilling your personal dreams and goals is possible with diligence and acute awareness that things do not stand still for very long in our dynamic economy. Surround yourself with the best advisors you can find and afford. I think they overwhelmingly pay for themselves if you elect to listen to the voice of experience. Sound advice indeed. Anyway, in a brilliant move, Roy Disney, after his resignation, initiated the Save Disney campaign. Meanwhile, Eisner and Jobs' relationship started to get cold. Not quite frozen. I thank you. This was that issue of film rights and sequel productions. Jobs knew the value of what he had. He forced Eisner's hand by making a bold offer that I suspect he knew Eisner could not accept, that Pixar would control production and maintain rights and Disney would be a distributor. This was around the time of Finding Nemo. Iger described a very strange move by Eisner. It was all quite a public spat. Eisner was trying to rubbish Finding Nemo before it came out, which would make it a flop, which in turn would restore Pixar's need for Disney. That was his plan. This is wishful thinking. I can't imagine an executive of this caliber would do this. It's not a causative action. What I mean to say is that saying something like, oh, this film is rubbish, it will bomb, won't make it happen. If anything, Streisand's effect. I recall Taleb saying in his book on Anti-Fragile that if you really want to sell a book, the best thing you can say is say how outrageously overrated this pile of shit is, and then everyone wants to buy it to find out what it is that's so overrated. Weird, anyway. Iger gives the impression that Eisner hated leverage over him more than anything else. Again, that's something I find hard to believe from such a high-level executive. As soon as you sell one single share in a company, the holder has a claim against it. That's leverage. Not very much, but it's there. As soon as you take $1 in financing, same thing. Seems weird. Maybe it shows the mentality of these people that they don't view it that way. Anyway, Jobs fired back, and I vaguely remember it. It was 2004 at the time. But Jobs did it with class. Instead of rubbishing the counterparty, never do that, never mention a competitor's name either, Jobs said, but they were joint venture partners at this time, remember? Jobs said, it's a shame Disney will not share in the success of Pixar. Whereas Eisner was saying that Pixar's output was crap. Yeah, you can feel the difference, can't you? If you happen to like Pixar's films, what's Eisner's judgment about you? He's saying you have poor taste and devaluing your time investment in these films. The Last Jedi. It never gets old. He's not recognised the goodwill equity of the consumers that have invested in those films. Again, I find it remarkable that such a high-flying executive would not get this. So Jobs' offer was refused. Yeah, Disney was right to turn that down. Jobs had played that well. Still, sales solves a lot of problems, and Finding Nemo and Pirates of the Caribbean did well. But it never just rains. The next few pages of the book detail the attempted hostile takeover by Comcast. And this is where it gets a bit like a chess game. So some time ago, I'd actually read about development in New York, and each city block has kind of like an allocated volume of sky. So you can build wide and low, or narrow and high. The volume per block is limited. And the idea of limiting volume is to keep light on the street. And there's added stipulations about tiers and step backs with height. You can probably see that at the high levels of the buildings. That's why some of the skyscrapers have retracted upper tiers. So you can buy some land that would account for a particular representative volume on that block, which would make buying the other land available more or less not viable. Because if you hold the majority of volume and don't develop, it just stops someone else from doing anything, let's say, economically viable. They just can't build up because you have bought up all that kind of sky volume. So it's a little bit of a chess game. You can make a lot of money by, blocking people out or granting access by selling your effective sky rights. I think Trump did a bit of money like this. Doesn't add value though. I mean, capitalism, so I suppose if you want it, you have to pay the asking price. Anyway, Comcast were prepared to pay the price for Disney. And this is the same kind of chess games we get into here. In this corporate world of big business and strategic purchasers, oftentimes suffering the winner's curse, poison pills, unexpected surprises, poison chalices, stock option vestiges, and all those games. But here was the twist. Comcast valued Disney at $64 billion, and that's fucking loads of cash. And interest on servicing any kind of debt like that would be untenable. Plus, the risk to a lending consortium. That's a lot of eggs in one basket should Disney fail. So this was a stock swap. And it turns out orchestrated by someone who used to work for Iger at ABC. And before they worked for Iger at ABC, they had previously worked for Disney 10 years prior. A bit of a revolving door going on. It's all a bit weird. So yeah, it's kind of notion that you work for a company, learn its flaws, go and work somewhere else, work to the top, then realise that your previous company that you worked at actually had good insight there as to what was undervalued or mismanaged. And now you're in a position to buy it and turn it around or merge it or asset strip it. It's an interesting book to read on all this kind of stuff. Is King Icahn, story of Carl Icahn. From one point of view, it's ensuring optimal shareholder value. From another, it's corporate raiding. So it's all a bit 4D chess kind of stuff. Who you know, where they are, what assets they control, who wants what for what price, and is it worth doing and over what time frame. The way Iger tells it is that he suspected someone on the board of Disney must be leaking internal issues to Comcast. Again, the leaker obviously wanted Eisner out and was covertly instigating this hostile takeover. In fact, Iger confirmed years later it was the actions of an intermediary that was being directed by one of the board members. At least they had the good sense to put a layer of anonymity between them. Dirty business. Disney Wars goes into a lot more detail about this. But the whole thing, which isn't mentioned in Iger's book, seems to be a ruse, and it trapped Eisner. As Comcast thought, or were led to believe this was a genuine offer and that Eisner was ready to do the transaction, when Comcast called, Eisner just rejected the offer offhand without even hearing a price or the offer price. He just told him no. So it caught him off guard, and Comcast were caught off guard. But this is the point. Any such offers have to be referred to the board and put to the shareholders. But Eisner shirked this obligation. So this is just one more piece of ammunition. But it got more complicated. Whoever was playing these behind the scenes games was very good. Comcast Holdings meant that if they did buy Disney, Comcast would have an effective monopoly and certain assets would need to be sold off. This transaction would certainly fall under regulatory scrutiny, very expensive, drawn out, lengthy procedure. Then, as it happens, Disney had good fortunes in performance and profitability, and this rocketed the stock price, and the maths on the stock swap offer changed and consequently had adverse effects on Comcast's share price, which made the offer even more unattractive. And so Comcast eventually withdrew. See, I think the person who instigated this knew that it wouldn't realistically stand a chance of going through, but they painted the picture that Eisner was ready to do a deal. In the aftermath, and with Roy Disney's very effective Save Disney campaign, Disney shareholders effectively voted out Eisner. I think they'd had enough with all these shenanigans going on. It just looked a mess. Staggering 40% of shareholders withheld voting support for Eisner's re-election. That's very damning. 53% of Americans want to see Trump in jail. So Eisner was ousted. Long story, read Disney Wars, it's all in there. So search for a new CEO, because Eisner's out. But the institutional imperative has strong force. And because Disney had been subject to a lot of scrutiny, there was that old sentiment that change had to happen. Yeah, that old cliche of bringing in a change agent. It's funny because I've seen this too. Really clever, smart, forward-thinking and innovative managers brought into a traditional reserved and conservative environment to foster change, but they're then kneecapped at every opportunity for them to make change. It just never works out. So I don't know why this kind of thinking persists. It's strange to me. We must bring in a change agent. Oh, they failed to change the company because we were so conservative, but we need another change agent. Yeah. Disney thought they needed external change, which put Iger in a very tentative position. It's easy for an external change agent to come in, point the blame and make changes. It's more difficult for a kind of quasi number two to say the same, effectively blaming the boss while they were complicit in enacting a lot of those orders. Put Iger in a dicey situation. Now, I guess if we're keeping score, this would be, in the film narrative, one of those low points. You know, Iger's at his most vulnerable now. He's about to get kicked out too, but he wants the number one position at the same time. In the Disney film structure, we're just coming up to what would be the central conflict. The initial conflict is identified, talked about, or manifest. Here we are. Eisner's out. Iger has the potential to move into the number 1 position, but it's almost untenable. Here, in Iger's book, this is really hammed up as a point of tension. So what was Iger to do? Well, here Iger interjects what's known as the helper inflection point on the hero's journey, just before the abyss and rebirth phase. You can see where it's going. It's brilliant. It follows film structure brilliantly. It's excellent. As Iger tells it, then the phone rang. Something like that. And it was Scott Miller. And Scott Miller had done some consulting for ABC in the past, so Iger knew of him from before. Scott Miller asked for a meeting with Iger, and it was arranged. A few days later, Miller dropped a 10-page deck in front of Iger. Miller clarified. This was Iger's campaign playbook. Scott Miller is a branding expert and expert in communication strategies, and I've got his book on the wish list. I checked out his webpage, and the closing paragraph on his website made me laugh. You know how this tactic plays out. In an email, people read the headline, subject line, maybe they read the first paragraph, skip the bullshit in the middle, scroll to the end and read the PS section. Of course, Miller knows this, and he's placed this little gem right at the end of his bio. It reads, Scott, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and has been included on several who's who's lists over the years before realising the list is basically a marketing scam. Nevertheless, to his great embarrassment, he bought one faux marble plaque. Genius. Genius. I used to get those emails from time to time about being included on the who's who. I skipped it, obviously, but thought that the list might be worth buying into, as only it seemed that rich people easily separated from their money would be on that list. I thought that might have value. Of course, Miller knows we're laughing at this fact, and we're laughing that he was suckered in, and we were not, and are therefore cleverer than he. And that releases a lot of tension for us, doesn't it? I'm sure you've noticed those LinkedIn profiles that are just so over the top, so built up, there's almost a barrier to contacting that person. You just think, oh, Jesus Christ, set the bar so high. So this is a really good way of diffusing this kind of asymmetry in information. Miller knows anyone reading that is likely to repeat this story. How did you read about Scott Miller, that communication strategist who was suckered in by the who's who scam? Yeah, we just can't not do it. And now he's got free advertising. And now we've played right into his trap. And I'll lay money he never actually fell for the who's who scam anyway. And we've just participated in his demonstration of competency. And now we actually do begin to realise he is a master. And we're not laughing anymore. Shit, we better give him a call. On the number? 303-809-5986. So yeah, Miller drops a campaign plan in Iger's lap. So this is it, a master plan, a new way. Will the hero of this story heed the advice of the mentor? What challenge and temptation will this opportunity present to Iger? Will this be transformative or suck our hero into the abyss? So this strategic plan laid out by Miller is the quest. Should our hero elect to take the advice of his mentor and follow that plan, we now have a lock-in. Miller knew Iger would not win this battle for CEO position as an incumbent, nor by being defensive, i.e. justifying his past actions. This was not about the past, it was about the future. Miller said to him, you must think, plan and act like an insurgent. And the big question is, what is being fought for? Focus, yeah? Clarity. This is what was required. Miller's advice was to make this point about the brand and how to grow it and protect it and what the priorities need to be to this end. Very clever, on point, crystal clear. So here we are. What's valuable? What's important? This is a values elicitation. What's important and why, and then how do we get there? Test, operate, test, exit. No fucking smart goals here. So first step, identify the strategic priorities. One item identified is a priority. Two is a list of two priorities, but it dilutes the priority of number one. Three might also be a priority, but that also dilutes priority two and dilutes priority number one. Four is not a priority. That's all you get. Three, that's it. Choose wisely. You can't solve all of the problems. Pick the top three. Have clarity beats clever. And here Iger is very clear. He says a company's culture is shaped by a lot of things, but this is one of the most important. You have to convey your priorities clearly and repeatedly. In my experience, it's what separates great managers from the rest. If leaders don't articulate their priorities clearly, then the people around them don't know what their priorities ought to be. Time and energy and capital gets wasted. People in your organisation suffer unnecessary anxiety because they don't know what they should be focused on. You can do a lot for the morale of the people around you, and therefore the people around them, just by taking the guesswork out of their day-to-day life. A CEO must provide the company and its senior team with a roadmap. A lot of work is complex and requires intense amount of focus and energy, but this kind of messaging is fairly simple. This is where we want to be. This is how we are going to get there. Once those things are laid out simply, so many decisions become easier to make and the overall anxiety of an entire organisation is lowered. So Iger gives it some thought. Rising to the hero's challenge, or in the Disney structure, the quest, now locked in, committed. His top 3 become: 1. Disney need to focus on creating quality content. With widening consumer choice, brand would be a strong decider for that choice. 2. Embrace technology to the fullest. First, in line with priority number 1, and then in ways of distribution. Number 3, become a global company. To continue to create the same things for the same loyal customers was stagnation. And these 3 priorities were tricky ones for Disney to fulfill. I suspect Eisner's approach to this was the 90s remake phase, where children of the 70s now had young kids who would enjoy the old stories, but there would be a need for them to be updated for modern sensibilities, and with a few one-liners for the adults and meta-commentary against the old 70s versions as a kind of nod to the parents and doffing of appreciation of the continued support. A little nostalgia. And, yes parents, you're smarter than your 5-year-old kids for getting that joke. So, talks with the board started. Miller also came out with another gem on this matter. To identify which board members were for, against, and swing states, as it were. And that is where the attention needed to go first, to get them on board. Remind you of politics, doesn't it? Go for the swing states, the purple states. Now, Eisner also makes mention of something very bizarre. He makes mention that early in this process of trying to get him into a CEO position of Disney, he was approached by Katzenberg, who, now at DreamWorks, who met him near Disney in Burbank, and Katzenberg told him, "You need to leave. You're not going to get this job. Your reputation is tarnished." And Katzenberg gave some advice. Do some pro bono work to rehabilitate your image. This left Iger speechless. What the fuck does that mean? Work for free? to improve a tarnished image? It sticks out as crazy talk. I don't know whether that was Katzenberg having a bit of fun or what. It's like one of those out of left field strange remarks. So yeah, once or twice in your life, someone who is either close to you or someone you hold as highly esteemed will say some dumb shit like that shakes you to your core, and it will come out of left field, and it will lodge right in your mind, and it will not easily be gotten out. Sometimes they're just wrong, sometimes they're on drugs, sometimes they're in highly stressed environments themselves, and the words they say are often said uncritically. And I've had this happen to me a couple of times. If there's one piece of advice I could give this, when everyone says something like this to you with some crazy outsider shit like this, challenge it immediately. Don't leave it in silence. Don't be dumbfounded. Challenge it immediately. You've got to know. A good question to ask, almost rote off the bat, is, does the evidence for that claim exist? Who has it, and can I examine it? At least then you get into a conversation. Anyway, yeah, Katzenberg's comments seem to really rock Iger. If Iger was that good, any company would be glad to hire him and pay him top dollar. If he was damaged goods, no one would want to touch him, except maybe the local chip shop or some such. I don't see how that rehabilitates anything. I've no idea what that even means. That's one of those pattern interrupt statements you throw at someone to shock them into a trance, and then be careful when you're in that trance, because whatever they say next goes straight into your unconscious. It bypasses all those critical filters. So I say you got to dig it out as soon as it happens, because if you just leave it, it festers, and then months later you're kind of still struggling with it, and you're thinking either the person who said it or I am insane. It's one of us, but you can't work out which it is. And what makes it worse is if you have to ask, it's probably you. That's why I say you got to dig it out immediately. So reading between the lines, I wonder if Katzenberg was trying to shoot a poison arrow at Disney and poach or neutralise Iger in the process. Install anxiety in the head of the competition, which would have dented the Disney-Pixar relationship, a DreamWorks primary competition. I'm going to assume that these are savvy players. I'll put it to you. Consider Disney and Pixar have done over $2 billion in revenue in their first few early films. And that was under the very strained relationship that Eisner had with Jobs. Imagine if that relationship was smoothed. With Eisner gone now, what happens if Iger patched things up with Pixar? Where would that leave DreamWorks? So I guess it's almost obvious, and I wonder if Iger left it vague in his book to let us fill in these details. He's provided us just enough dots for us to connect. It's got us engaged in that happenstance. Though he does say that this advice did annoy him and made him quite angry. It's easy to get caught up in rumour mills, to worry about this person's perception or view, or that person's perception of what someone else might say or write about you. It's easy to become defensive and petty and to want to lash out when you feel you're being unfairly misrepresented. Iger states that he didn't believe he deserved the job. He didn't think that he was entitled to it, but he did believe he was right for it. And part of that was remaining steady in the face of so much publicly expressed doubt. Iger recalls one headline in the Orlando Sentinel that said, "Eisner's hair far from apparent." Many others expressed similar sentiments, and for a while it seemed that every day someone was writing or talking about what an abdication of responsibility it would be if the board named Iger CEO. And to add insult to injury, and to kick our hero when he's down, right on cue as per the hero's journey, at that moment of truth, there is the amusing story of Jerry Roche, who ran an executive search agency, and he'd been asked to benchmark Iger. To me, this is inconceivable. So there's this guy in your company. He's been running more or less a quasi number 2 position for 10 years. You know how good he is. What the fuck have you been doing during those board meetings then if you don't know how good he is? And you, as a board member, yes, you lazy fuck, should be the one out there talking, measuring, meeting other CEOs, doing your own fucking benchmarking, you lazy bastards. And to outsource such an important role. Okay. Yeah, that's it. To trust an external agent to assess your man better than you can tells me something about the level of anxiety the board must have had over this issue. Or that Roche had a bloody good insurance bond that they could hit if Roche placed a dud in Disney. But again, it's kind of a political thing. I'm sure the board would have felt that, because of the external publicity, that just simply promoting Iger, they had to make it look like a fight. And they had to make it look like they'd exhausted all other searchers earnestly. So it was a compromise. It was a bit of a PR, I think, though Iger doesn't make any hint of this, but I suspect that that's what was going on. But there is such a thing as overdoing it. So the way Iger tells it is that by this time he'd met with the board multiple times to talk about the possibility of taking over from Eisner. And during those meetings, there was no question that Iger hadn't answered by now, except the ones they didn't want to ask. And perhaps that was it. They didn't want to embarrass themselves by asking those questions, which would have revealed their ignorance and been perceived as being stupid questions that showed how little they actually knew about their number 2 man that had for so long worked under Eisner. So, again, the benchmarking was perhaps an attempt to fill in their ignorance by, not admitting that they didn't know, or by revealing their ignorance by asking the questions that ought to have been asked at those board meetings. Anyway, Iger protested at being benchmarked. Well, you have to put up a fight in it. So one of the board members said, just do it, just get it done. Yeah, that pissed me off anyway. But maybe this was the test. Maybe Iger is hinting here that it was a perfunctory benchmarking exercise. But by all accounts, in the book, Iger was made to jump through hoops. So Iger went out to New York to meet with this Jerry Roche chap, who was thumbing through Disney Wars, which had just been published. What a lazy fucker. I don't know what he could have gleaned from Disney Wars. If anything, Iger gets a few mentions in that book, largely neutral to positive mentions. Comes across as a straight player, Stuart. That's how Stuart writes about him. It's mostly about Eisner, though. Iger's portrayed as an on-team player, no backstabbing, no machinations, not setting traps, though shrewd. But I can't imagine that their lawyers would have let anything go through into Disney Wars that was perhaps contentious or potentially damaging to Disney. In fact, Stuart mentions a rather interesting occurrence that happened in that regard when he was writing Disney Wars. Funnily enough, you just can't make it up. At the time, Eisner was also writing a book about Disney. But Eisner had a lot of stuff in that book that the lawyers did stop. Stuart remarks in Disney Wars when he met Eisner to talk about writing an inside story on Disney. Eisner conceded that his book, Work in Progress, Eisner's autobiography, had been heavily edited by the lawyers and other Disney executives. So, I don't know what this guy was looking for in these books. What's also unbelievable was that Tony Schwartz, who co-wrote Work in Progress, also wrote Trump's Art of the Deal book, had made extensive notes during Eisner's time at Disney. Not all of those notes made it into the book, but embarrassingly, Schwartz's notes were used as evidence when subpoenaed by Katzenberg in a later court case. It was damning stuff. And this was the Tony Schwartz to whom Eisner confessed doubts of his biggest career mistake when hiring Orvitz. This was the Tony Schwartz that Eisner called. He was the first person that Eisner called to confess his mistake. Went right down in Schwartz's notebook with many, many other things, it seems. Oh boy. Again, I'm kind of staggered to learn that when Eisner took reins in 1984, he had to call his lawyer to find out his way to the Burbank studios and seemed not to know terms like book value and return on equity. I'm kind of staggered, what did he know? Good question. I mean, Disney Wars is a fascinating read. But at the time, to Eisner's relief, in the many interviews leading up to the board vote that would install Eisner, no one had asked him much about Disney, either the company or its products. And he later wrote in a draft of his autobiography, "To be honest, I knew little about Disney, little about the culture or even the actual films. If Disney had not been under siege and under real risk of being acquired and sold off in pieces, I would not have passed the interview process. If Disney production had not faltered creatively, I would not have passed the interview process. If Roy Disney had not had blind faith in me for reasons I will never understand, I would have not passed the interview process. And if Sid Bass had not backed blind faith in me, I would not have passed the interview process." Oh boy, I don't know, it's craziness. So for me, if I was paying top dollar to a headhunter to benchmark this number 2 guy that had been in my company for 10 years, I'd pay him so much that he can go and take the author of all these books out, get them pissed, take them somewhere expensive, get them drunk, get them fine as Petrus, take them to a whorehouse after applying with cocaine, and then get them to tell me the real dirt on these guys, not read a lawyer-sanitized version of it. What a twat. Since Schwartz's notes were used in Katzenberg's court case, I'm going to guess and say that transcripts of those were available. I can't fathom the thinking here. I mean, what's this headhunter going to ask that the current board were not? Anyway, so Iger was in this guy's office for 30 minutes. Some bullshit Q&A on issues from this tell-all book. And then Jerry Roche's assistant came in with news that his private jet that he was taking to go to a wedding would be leaving soon. And with that, he just got up and left. Just like that. What a twat. I mean, I don't get it. Isn't the whole point of having private jets is that they leave when you're ready? Whatevs. I don't know, maybe this was all a contrived exercise. I've seen a few strange reactions to stress, and this is the kicker. You never know what people will do. The only way to find out is to push them to cracking point, and I've never really been sure on the wisdom of this either, because once they've cracked, that damage can be permanent, and that might not ever have happened in the real world, but you've induced it artificially, deliberately by pushing buttons. But then, if the person never cracks, and you keep piling on the pressure, you never get to know how they're going to react, and that point eventually becomes intolerable. But if you know that this is the game being played and you're never going to crack, what do? Pretend, and then you feign a false breakdown or something just to end the game. Strategically feign a temper tantrum or something. It's all bollocks. It seems that this is what actually happened. After 6 months of interviews, uncertainty, other candidates meeting with the board, Iger was called in one more time. Wow, I'd love to know what the threshold criteria was. What was that board looking for? Was this some kind of X-Factor interview? We know it when we see it. So, the question that broke the camel's back then. Tell us, Mr. Iger, why should we believe that you are different? What do you think Michael did wrong? What would you have done differently? Oh, that pissed Iger off. Because he'd been asked that question dozens of times on prior occasions, Iger finally snapped and said, I find that offensive, I'm not going to answer it. And with that, Iger left the meeting, skirting with contempt, dangerous road. So for those keeping score in the Disney film structure, this is the midpoint, a release of minor tension, and the next is the closing of Act 2, which is the lead up to tension for the final act. So again, see how this book's structured. So Disney playing of itself, very clever. It's a compelling read.